These are the various classroom afflictions according to the caption. Math anxiety, Latin convulsions, chemistry conniptions, physics floundering, woodshop apathy, basic stupidity. We're dealing with chemistry conniptions. Stuff is tricky. I know it's tricky. At least here you can read, if something really is confusing, you can always replay things. Well, I've listened to that 4 times and it still doesn't make any sense. Well, sorry about that. Following up on isotopes. There is a way to figure out if you find a mummy, you find an old painting, you find, you dig up an old city and there's pieces of wood in there, or there's bodies. There are ways to figure out how long ago these things existed. And it's done by carbon dating. Uses isotopes. Oops, I'm gonna go back here. So here's what you need to know about carbon. Right now, in the atmosphere around you, there's carbon dioxide. We breathe it out. Plants take it in and incorporate it into their bodies. A small, reliable fraction of the carbon in carbon dioxide is carbon-14, which is radioactive. It emits radiation, and in doing so, it changes. This is what happens, is that isotopes that emit radiation do it to get more stable. Sometimes they just spit energy out. That's gamma rays. Sometimes one of the neutrons will literally fall apart. An electron comes shooting out, leaving behind a proton. A neutron is technically an electron and a proton slammed together. Electron comes out of that, you wind up with a proton, and that changes the element, right? You now have one more proton than you had before. And sometimes a whole piece comes out, 2 neutrons, 2 protons, that's alpha radiation. The electron's beta radiation. And all of the beta and alpha change the nature of the element. Well, carbon-14 is the radioactive carbon that is a tiny fraction of the carbon dioxide around us, which means, a piece of wood here, it's a tiny fraction of this piece of wood, because that plant was taking in carbon dioxide, putting it into its wood, and it kept doing that right up until the time it died. And then it doesn't take any more in, and all that can happen is the carbon itself, because it is radioactive, it will fall apart. And what carbon-14 does is it changes, it emits beta radiation. And that changes it to nitrogen. One more proton goes up the atomic, the periodic table. And the nitrogen is a gas, so it dissipates. It does this on a reliable schedule. What does that mean? A half-life is a term given to something that can change. So you start with one thing and it can change into something else. And the question is, so if we start with this much, how long does it take until there's only half of it left and that the rest of it's changed into something else? It's applied to radioactive materials that change elements. It's applied to things you take into your body that you change into other things, or you flush out through your kidneys, or you breathe out through the air. It's like your what's the half-life of vitamin D in the body? It's actually quite long. Vitamin C, minutes. So in this case, how long does it take the starting amount of carbon-14 that the plants have before half of it's gone? And it is 57 and 30 years. So about 6,000 years, the small amount of carbon-14 that it started with is now half that. Well, they're using a different number. They're using 56 rather than 57. Apparently this is newer. This is a fairly old overhead. They probably, but here's the thing. So half of it, and then another, the same amount of time, half again and half again and half again and half again. So the longer it goes, every half-life you have half of what you had at the last one, until eventually there's a very, very, very tiny amount left of what was a tiny amount in the first place. Is that there's a lot of carbon in this, but there's not a lot of carbon-14. And the amount that's there can tell me how long it was since this tree was chopped down and incorporated into this cabinet. So after between 50 and 60,000 years, I just read an article this past week that somebody's come up with a way to kind of stretch this. Is that they've got a better detection system. That's still, it's one of those things that you hear, and then later on you either keep hearing it or you'd never hear it again, and it turns out the system didn't work as well as they thought. That's science. But once you've cleared 50 to 60,000 years, 60,000 years, is that there's not enough of the original carbon-14 left for you to be able to get a good measurement. So you can tell how much it's dwindled because it's not really enough to measure. And anything older than that, you can't use carbon dating on. So this goes back in a couple of ice ages. Doesn't go back to the dinosaurs, doesn't even go a fraction of the way back to the dinosaurs. Is that for anything that's really, really old, that's a fossil, there are radioactive materials that settle into the sediments that also do this thing over a much longer half-life. And so for things like they call argon dating or uranium dating, they can help figure out the age of a very, very, very ancient, millions and millions of years old fossil. But carbon dating is good for, mummies and houses and paintings and that sort of thing. Okay, the last thing we're going to cover. Let me go back to this. Circling around the nucleus, sort of. It gets very complicated and I don't entirely understand it. Are electrons that are so tiny that for a very, very long time, nobody knew if they had any mass at all. It's now considered that they've got this teeny, 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 tiny amount of mass, so little that it doesn't really affect the mass of the whole atom. So we kind of ignore that it has any atomic mass at all. But it has a negative charge. Every electron has a negative charge, and remember, every proton has a positive charge. So we'll talk about electrons. So I've got no in quotes, which means sort of no. As far as we're concerned, it has no mass. So these electrons are moving around. When people first figured this out, the easiest thing that they could compare it to was planets going around the sun. So they called that what the electrons were in were orbits, even though you could get more than one electron in an orbit, and the planets don't do that. But, you know, that was simple. And then before very long, they realized that, you know, the planets go around in kind of a flat plane. And the electrons were going kind of all over the place. They, you know, they were not staying in one flat plane. So they started to call them orbitals. And now we realize even that isn't really fair, that there's a level where the electrons are just zipping all over the place. And it's almost that they're in a sphere, they're kind of every place at once. And so you'll hear those levels called shells. For us, it doesn't matter. You can call them orbits, you can call them orbitals, you can call them shells. It's distances, really. And in close to the nucleus, there's only room for 2 electrons. The next level out, there's only room for 8 electrons. And the next level out, you get to 8 electrons, and then it starts to get weird. And you start to get sublevels and stuff that you need to learn about in more advanced chemistry. And we're going to ignore. That's what the bridge does on the periodic table. Where's my periodic table? There are columns in the periodic table. And they have numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then there's numbers along the bridges. Like I said, we're going to try to ignore the bridge. There are elements there that are important in living things, but don't really factor into the biology we're going to talk about in these chapters. So we're just going to look. Now, these are not just arbitrary numbers on the column. This number corresponds to how many electrons are in the very outer level of these atoms. If they have a balanced number of electrons to protons, if the negative charges and the positive charges are in balance, an uncharged atom, then what's in the last level out? Well, here, column 1, there's only 1 electron out there. Column 2, there's 2 electrons, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now you notice there's only 2 in the first row. That's the smaller level. 1 electron in the one that holds 2, 2 electrons in the one that holds 2. So the periodic table So the column number equals the amount of electrons in an outer column. Now we talked about how nucleus could be unstable. There's a stability here too, but it's the stability that has to do with chemistry. Electrons are what basically produces chemistry. And if you have a level that's supposed to hold 8 electrons and it's only got 1 electron, that's not stable. If you have a level that's supposed to hold 8 electrons and it's only got 7 electrons, that's not stable. Anything that isn't filling it out is an unstable number of electrons, and they will react with all sorts of things, and they'll dump electrons off and they'll steal electrons in order to get to that full number, to get the little shell to 2, to get the next one to 8, to get the next one to 8. Is that sodium, magnesium. In its uncharged state, sodium has 1 lonely electron in its outer shell. That is very, very unstable. you can get sodium in its metallic form, and it is really, really reactive. You can blow stuff up with it. That isn't the sodium that's in table salt. That sodium has lost an electron. Now its outer shell is the level that was below it, that has 8 electrons in it. That's stable. But now you have 1 proton inside that is no longer balanced off because you lost 1 electron. So in column 1 and column 2, you dump off an electron, you dump off 2 electrons. You wind up with more positive charges than negative charges because you've lost negative charges. Every time you lose an electron, lose a negative charge. Column 1, the ions tend to be +1. That's what sodium is in most of the world. It's a +1 ion, very stable. Calcium, +2. Magnesium, +2. It's in column 2. So you dump off 1 or 2, fairly easy to get rid of them. And then your level that used to be inside is now the outer level, and it's full. Oops, that's supposed to be a 7. Column 7, 1 shy of being full. So these things will grab electrons from all over the place. So they can be in their uncharged form. When they're not quite full, they want to grab stuff. They are very reactive. Here's chlorine. The chlorine that's very active, that's looking to grab stuff, is the chlorine that's packaged in bleach. Bleach, pretty nasty. The chloride, the stable form where it's stolen its electron and now the outer shell is full, is the chloride in table salt. Not really reactive, not poisonous. You don't want to drink bleach, but you can drink, salt water. And again, now you wind up with 1 extra electron, 1 extra negative charge. And so you wind up being a negative ion. It's an atom that has a charge, or a molecule that has a charge is an ion. These outer, the last column, those tend to be materials that are not particularly reactive chemically. So helium, neon, argon, krypton. Neon, you can do things with it electrically and make it produce pretty colors, but it doesn't chemically react with much of anything. They used to, in fact, on the one that I hand out, the periodic table I hand out, it isn't numbered column 8, it's labeled column 0, because that's an old designation for it. These don't do anything. Now, there's middle columns. When you need to dump off 3 or you need to grab 3 in order to get to that stable number, that's not easy to do. It's much easier to go up to another atom that needs electrons and go, I'll share one of mine with you if you share one of mine with me, or with you if you share with me. Or maybe I'll share 2 of them with you and you can share 2 of them back with me. In carbon dioxide, the carbon shares 2 electrons with the 2 oxygens. Each oxygen is sharing 2. We'll get to that when we get to bonds, but that's later. Not too much later, but it's after the exam. So these tend to form certain types of molecules where electrons are shared. Now, atoms are molecules that don't have a charge, but they're not stable because their electrons are not stable. They're going to react by grabbing stuff or dumping stuff off. They're called radicals. And in our chemistry, the most common radical that we have to deal with is oxygen. Oxygen's in column 6. It's looking to grab 2 electrons from somewhere. And a lot of times from our chemistry, oxygen atoms just come out by themselves. Right now in the air around us, the oxygen exists as what's called O2. It's a molecule where 2 oxygen atoms each are sharing 2 electrons with each other. And pretty stable. Radical oxygen, not stable at all. So we have a whole bunch of chemistry that goes after the oxidation of these radicals that we call antioxidants. And vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin A, vitamin D to some extent, antioxidants. And they discovered this stuff about oxidation and radicals a long time ago. And then they discovered that we have all these chemicals, a lot of which we get from our food, that helps to tamp down what the oxygen is doing, say an antioxidant. So they went, oh, this is great, let's just eat lots and lots and lots of these antioxidants. Eat all the vitamin C you can get, it's fine. Don't eat all the vitamin D you can get, it can build up to toxic levels. But vitamin C, you just flush out anything extra. Produces relatively expensive urine. But we found in the last 10 to 20 years that some of this oxygen release chemistry our bodies depend on as a signal. When you exercise, your muscle cells release a lot of oxygen radicals, and that sends a signal to the muscle cells that, okay, we need to build the cells up. If you're taking a lot of antioxidants, you don't build muscles as well as if you're not taking a lot of antioxidants. It turns out that cancer cells, we have some of our immune system, our fighter cells will go up to bacteria or it'll go up to cancer cells, and it'll literally spit oxygen radicals at them to kill them. A whole bunch of antioxidants can get in the way of that. And so your ability to fight cancers, especially early on, or your ability to fight certain types of infections is compromised because you've got too many antioxidants in the system. So for people to go, oh, I heard you got cancer, you need to take all these nutrients, is some of those nutrients are actually counterproductive for cancers. So the antioxidants are not necessarily a good thing. Okay, this is the cutoff, is that up till here is going to be on the exam, is that I'm going to pick up with chemical reactions for the second exam, if you're looking at my notes. I know that I got radicals under chemical reactions on the notes, but I'm going to bump chemical reactions to the next thing. And then we'll pick this chapter up after the exam.